The first time I saw my husband's name in a police report, my hands stopped being mine. My name is Rhea Calder, and until last winter I believed in sensible love. I grew up in a town where porches sag, where the ocean throws its temper against granite and nobody pretends to be more than they are. When I met Adam Price, he seemed exactly right for that place. He was steady and attentive, a man who remembered grocery lists and left me the last blueberry muffin. He told quiet jokes, fixed wobbly chairs, and listened when I spoke about my design clients. I had been alone for a long time, and he looked like an answer. We married in a courthouse on a clear Friday, my mother whispering that simplicity lasts longer than spectacle. We rented a cedar-shingled cottage near the harbor, the kind with a narrow garden that could hold only one hydrangea bush and a rusted bird feeder. Life shrank to the shape of comfort. I began to memorize the sound of his boots on the steps, the way he gripped a mug with both hands, the scar he said he got from a bicycle crash when he was 12. The first wound arrived like a splinter. It was not the scar or the late text or the unusually careful way he locked his phone. It was a story that changed. He had grown up in Ohio, he once said, in a town so flat you could watch your dog run away for 3 days. Later, he said Pennsylvania, then corrected himself with a laugh. He hated talking about the past, he said, because it bored him. I wanted to believe that explanation. It was tidy, it excused my curiosity, it let married life be soft and warm. One October night, we hosted 2 neighbors for chowder and bread in our narrow kitchen. The conversation turned to names. Someone said, "Price, that's Welsh, right?" Adam shrugged, his jaw tight, and said his father had taken the name from a stepfather. It wasn't important, he added, and went out to refill the woodpile. The air left the room with him. Our guests traded looks and moved to safer topics, weather and the lingering goals. I smiled and refolded the napkins. A week later, a clinic letter came, plain and white, addressed to an Adam with a different middle initial. He snatched it from the pile and told me it was a billing error. His tone was light, his eyes were not. That night he slept curled away from me, and I listened to the restless turn of the sheets, counting the seconds between his breaths. I told myself all marriages had private corners, that love asks us to accept mystery. I slept in patches, and woke with the muffled certainty that something in our house had tilted out of level. I did not confront him, not yet. I watered the hydrangea, wiped down the kitchen counters, sent proofs to clients, and laid out the bills in neat rows. I made our life look ordinary until it matched my face. But when I turned off the porch light at 9, I saw a police cruiser slow at the corner. It paused, glided forward, then stopped again. The officer looked down at a clipboard, lifted his head, and looked toward our house. He did it twice, as if mapping a problem to a place. I stood in the shadow by the coat hooks, silent, feeling a thread pull tight behind my ribs. The cruiser drove on. The porch settled, the pipes hummed. When I went back inside, Adam was in the kitchen, drying the same bowl over and over. He smiled too quickly and asked about dinner. I asked nothing in return, but the shape of my life had changed, small and decisive as a switch in the dark. The first spark had caught. I could not unsee it, and I would not pretend to. In the days that followed, my world narrowed to the sound of paper. Receipts whispered from drawers, envelopes slid through the slot with their pale throats closed. I kept house like a careful archivist, sorting our life into labeled stacks while my mind traveled places my feet could not. When Adam left for work, he grew precise, almost military in his preparations, phone in his back pocket, jacket already zipped. He said he was estimating jobs for a small contractor, a man named Harlan who preferred cash and trusted nobody who wore cologne. I nodded, and packed his lunch into the good container. At night, conversation thinned. He told me about a crawlspace that smelled like cats and old pennies. I told him about a client who wanted ocean blue paint and meant something else. When I reached for him, he was warm and present, and when I slept, he spun away again. He began to forget small truths. He said he had never broken his arm, then made a joke about the cast he'd worn in 10th grade. He claimed he did not eat breakfast, then asked where the cereal was. Each contradiction was tiny enough to excuse, but I felt them like grit in my shoes. The social fabric around us noticed what I would not say. The neighbors still waved, but their greetings came slower. At the small church by the harbor, the pastor asked if I would join the autumn food drive, and his eyes held the question he did not voice. My mother called to ask if Adam had found a primary care doctor, since men need reminders. I said yes, and set the phone down with shaking fingers. I had learned as a child that humiliation arrives not with shouting, but with the sound of someone choosing to believe you are fine. When the leaves yellowed and the wind made knives of the mornings, Adam began leaving earlier. He stopped for coffee at a shop across town, even though there was one on our street. He returned late and damp, the kind of tired that adds edges to a person. I wanted to catch him in a lie, but I feared what truth would cost. We needed the second income. We had a lease that renewed in January. Undoing a marriage is not dramatic in the way television promises. It is a series of numbers that will not add up, and the dread of calling your landlord. I kept my questions under glass, choosing silence the way a surgeon chooses a scalpel. There is a violence that lives in noise, and another kind that breathes in quiet. I wanted the second kind, the kind that feels like restraint and turns out to be strength. Each night I scrubbed the sink until it shone. I wore sweaters that smelled like cedar. I learned the creak of every board. In that disciplined calm, I watched him. One evening, he returned carrying a cardboard box he would not open in front of me. He said it held protective gear for work. He stored it on the high shelf in the hall closet, where the antique quilts used to rest. Later, when he showered, I stood on a chair and felt the box with my fingertips. Inside were folders, the stiff weight of plastic sleeves, the cold flatness of something laminated. I came down before the water stopped, every part of me still and ordered, like glasswork cooling in a kiln. We went to bed. He slept. I watched the window glow with the dim orange of the streetlight, and said the vow I had not admitted even to myself. I would find out exactly who I had married, and I would decide, without panic or spectacle, what that knowledge required. I would not shout. I would not plead. I would learn the shape of the truth, and then I would place my hands on my own life, and turn it back toward light. I began with the things nobody guards, public records, the graveyard of data we scatter behind us. In the quiet hour after dawn, I sat at our kitchen table with my laptop and a mug cooling by my wrist. I searched county databases, state registries, the little portals that look like they were built in 2002 and never updated. I typed his name and the small variations of it, then I tried the spelling a neighbor had muttered during chowder, a stray hint from a year ago that had gone nowhere. The page returned with a careful refusal, no results found, then another page cracked open, not dramatic, but final. A booking record sat under a different last name, one letter from the laughing Welsh myth he had offered. The photo was him, thinner and with a beard, eyes dulled into the camera as if the lens and the law were the same thing. The charge was not theft or a bar fight. It was domestic assault. The date predated our first message by 18 months. There was a case number, and below it a bland sentence about a restraining order filed by a woman I did not know. I wrote the case number on an index card because it felt like something heavy enough to hold. My hands had returned to me, and they shook only once, like a bird testing the air. The state's website offered a way to request the police report. I filled the form, attached the fee, and clicked submit. The kitchen seemed to tilt, as if I had stood too quickly. That afternoon, an email arrived from a records clerk named Lena Park. She had a crisp tone that steadied me. The report would be available for pickup at the precinct. She suggested I bring identification. The next day, I told Adam I needed to meet a client downtown, and walked into the station with my chin level and my coat buttoned. The building had the familiar municipal smell of coffee and dust. Ms. Park was younger than I expected, with careful eyes and a blue cardigan. She handed me the envelope over the counter, her hand a small bridge between us. "You can read it here if you want," she said. "Sometimes people prefer not to carry it home." I took the offer. I found a wooden chair under a bulletin board listing neighborhood watch times. I opened the envelope and saw the header, the date, the black ink that made facts into monuments. The report was not lurid. It was a record of an argument, a plate broken on a kitchen floor, a neighbor's call, the arrival of officers, a bruise photographed on a woman's forearm, a statement read in a flat voice. There was a line about a name change petition in another county, filed 3 months later. There was a note about probation, about missed counseling sessions. At the bottom, there was a signature I recognized as his, only slanted. The proof object sat in my lap like a cold stepping stone. I could cross there, or choose to drown. I thanked Miss Park and asked one question, low enough not to echo. If someone violated probation by leaving the state without permission, is there a way to notify the right person without causing a scene? She studied me for a second that felt like a test, then wrote a number on a sticky note. "This is the officer assigned to that unit. Information can be left without your name." She paused. "If you're in danger, there are other steps. But if you're not, quiet can be powerful." I walked home through a wind that smelled like salt and iron. I called my mother and told her I loved her without context. I called a lawyer a friend had used during her divorce, a woman named Claire who returned my message at 7 and spoke to me like an engineer explaining a bridge. We discussed leases, joint accounts, the contents of a hall closet. We touched on restraining orders and hypotheticals, and she told me what documentation a judge respects. She did not tell me what to feel. That part was mine. That night, I made tea and sat at the table while Adam showered. I took down the cardboard box from the high shelf. Inside were a few pay stubs, a fake reference letter printed on an inkjet that bled at the corners, and copies of the police report with a different case number, the names blacked out with marker. He had carried his past into our home like a dangerous tool wrapped in cloth. When he came out of the bathroom, steam following like a small weather system, I was putting the box back. He kissed my hair and asked if the client liked the paint. "She did," I said, and watched him dry his hands. There are moments when choice presents itself cleanly, stripped of romance. I set the proof back on its shelf and began the quiet work of turning the life I had built away from the person who had borrowed it. I did not stage a scene. I arranged an afternoon. On a Tuesday when the sky was the color of pewter, I took the day off and met Claire in her office. We reviewed the documents she had prepared, a separation agreement that protected the lease in my name, a notice to our bank to freeze joint transactions, and a request for temporary protective relief if events required it. Her sentences were brief, her pen steady. She slid a slim binder across the desk, each tab a hinge toward a future I could own. "Serve him at home," she advised. "Have a witness present, even if it's just a neighbor stepping in to borrow sugar. Keep your voice low. Let the paper do what it does." I nodded. On my way home, I stopped at the precinct and left a voicemail at the number Ms. Park had given me. I did not accuse, I described. There had been a probation order, I said, and the subject was now in our town, listed on no registry, using a different name. I did not leave my own. I felt, for the first time in weeks, like someone who could steer a boat instead of cling to a life ring. At 4, I set the kitchen table as if for coffee. The hydrangea had browned, but I trimmed a stem and put it in a jar. I placed the binder on the placemat where Adam usually ate, a small square of order among the facts. I texted our neighbor, Miriam, and asked if she could stop by to return the baking dish she had borrowed. She replied with a single heart, the kind that understood without rehearsals. Adam arrived at 5, damp and sullen from weather and work. He stamped his boots by the door, smelled the coffee, and relaxed into the picture I had made. "What's the occasion?" he asked, a crooked smile learning its lines. "Have a seat," I said. My voice surprised me, level as a plumb line. He sat. I opened the binder to the first tab. The police report lay on top, the date in the corner quiet and absolute. He stared for a second, then smirked, then looked again. I watched the cards in his hands fall like rain. "This isn't what you think," he began. "It is exactly what it is," I answered. He reached for laughter, then for anger, then for pity. Each attempt glanced off a surface I had polished. "People get in fights," he said. She was dramatic. It was nothing. I turned a page, the probation notice, the name change, the missed counseling sessions. "You told me your past bored you," I said. "It turns out it is the most interesting thing about you." His jaw flexed. "You went digging. That's not love." "Love is not a shovel," I said. There was a knock on the back door. Miriam's face appeared in the small pane of glass, friendly and deliberate. I let her in, took the empty baking dish, and thanked her out loud. She looked at the table, at the binder, at Adam, and placed her hand on my shoulder with the effortless audacity of women who have decided to join one another's lives. "I'll be next door," she said. "Call if you need anything." She left the door open a fraction, the air a narrow channel. I slid the separation agreement forward. "You'll find the terms fair," I said. "Your things are packed in the hallway. There's a room at the Harbor Inn for 2 nights. After that, Claire will coordinate a time for you to collect the rest." I kept my gaze on the edge of the paper, where the fibers lifted like grass. He laughed without sound, a bark swallowed. "You can't make me sign this." "I can't," I said. "But the bank is frozen, and the landlord knows the lease is mine. Your employer will receive a request to confirm the dates on your application. And the number you should be most concerned about is in a voicemail that has nothing to do with me." He blinked, once, twice, like someone adjusting to snow. "You called the cops." "I left information in the place it belongs." He rose, then sat, the chair legs whispering on tile. He considered making this loud, and then he saw the smallness awaiting him if he did. "You think you've won," he said. "I think the truth has entered the room," I replied, and let the silence do its work. He signed. It was not heroism, nor was it surrender that makes a story neat. It was a man with fewer moves than he believed, confronted by paper that refused to blink. When he lifted his head, something feral had gone out of his eyes, replaced by a tired vacancy I recognized from a photograph under a different name. He carried his bag to the door. He did not slam it. He did not swear. He stepped into the gray evening and left the world of our cottage as quietly as he could. I stood in the kitchen with the refrigerator humming and the hydrangea nodding slightly in a draft, and felt a stillness settle, cool and clean, like the floor after a storm when the water has finally chosen its path down the drain. The next morning began with the sound of gulls and the soft patience of rain. The house felt larger, the way a hand feels after a tight ring is removed. I walked from room to room, touching surfaces as if greeting them by name. The hall closet stood open, empty of other people's secrets. I set the quilts back on the high shelf, and slid the cardboard box to the curb with the recycling. The air inside the cottage warmed into something kind. In the days that followed, logistics made an honest companion. Claire shepherded papers through their measured channels. The bank thawed for me alone. The landlord stopped by with a polite nod and a firm handshake. Miriam appeared each evening with a small offering, a pear, a jar of broth, a handful of stories that carried their own quiet weather. My mother came on Sunday, made tea, and sat at the table telling me about a stray cat that had decided to live under her porch. We did not discuss men as problems to be solved. We discussed the business of living as women who know the cost of peace. 2 weeks later, a short letter arrived from a state office I had not known existed. It thanked me for information, and informed me that an individual had been reminded of his obligations. It did not give details, and I did not need them. Some victories are measured only by the absence of footsteps returning to your door. On a clear morning, I stood in the garden with pruning shears and trimmed the dead heads from the hydrangea. The plant was more sticks than flowers, but the buds for next year hid under their brown paper. I slipped a branch into the soil to root a new shrub, a copy that would become itself. The work was small, patient, almost ceremonial. I thought of the police report, the straight lines of ink that had once bruised my eyes, and I felt a steadiness spread from my wrists to my throat. Paper had been used to lie about a life, and paper had been used to return a life to its owner. The symmetry satisfied me. Friends asked if I felt angry. I did, in flashes that passed like shadows of birds. Mostly, I felt relief. I had chosen not to perform my pain for an audience, and that choice kept my dignity intact. The revenge people imagine is fire, the revenge I wanted was weather. I wanted erosion, accountability, the slow insistence of truth wearing a false structure down until it could no longer stand. I got that, and I stood in its quiet. In January, I repainted the kitchen cabinets, covering the flaking white with a color called Tidal Cove that looked gray until the sun hit it, then turned softly blue. I replaced our mismatched mugs with 4 that felt good in the hand. I set one aside for Miriam, who now let herself in with a knock that asked nothing and offered everything. I began to run again along the seawall, passing the same family with the same yellow lab, and I learned the rhythm of my breath without measuring it against another person's pace. On a Sunday, I opened the binder Claire had given me and slid the police report to the back. I kept it, not as a wound, but as part of the record of my own competence. I could find a fact, hold it, and decide with it. I could protect the edges of my life without breaking the center. I mailed Claire a thank you note, written in a hand steadier than the one that had scribbled an index card weeks before. Spring felt possible. The bird feeder swung on a fresh wire. I bought seeds that promised blooms if given patience and ordinary care. Peace is not the absence of memory, it is the habit of arranging your days so memory does not rule them. When I woke, I made coffee, stood by the window, and watched light turn the harbor from slate to silver. The house was quiet enough to let small, good sounds reach me, the kettle's sigh, the first car on the street, the words I said to myself that no one could edit. If the past insists, I know where the papers live. If fear whispers, I have its correct address. I do not pretend I saw everything early, or that my caution was heroism. I tell the story as it happened, because telling it well is another kind of ownership. The revenge I took was not a spectacle. It was a restoration, a careful return of my life to my own hands. It was a woman choosing not to shout, and finding that silence can be a bell. If this story touched you, share your thoughts below. And subscribe for more stories of quiet revenge.